right. And you can hear me? Good? Yeah, all right. Well, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining our session this morning. So this morning's session, it's part one of part two. We have a second session later this evening. And the objective of the session is to really showcase all the wonderful work that has taken place on developing adaptation and mitigation strategy using climate model data. And some of the motivation for me to put this session together was out of curiosity to see how people are using climate model data for these things. And I don't know if Eric recalls, but I was really delighted when I saw all the abstracts that we got for these sessions, and it was really wonderful and exciting to see all the wonderful research that is happening in this area. Of course, one problem that arose for us was trying to select oral presentations out of all of these brilliant abstracts, and they were all really very excellent. It was a tough challenge to choose. But we have a very nice, I think, selection of presentations in this session and in the session later today. So this morning's session is more focused on the adaptation and mitigation side of this. And so our first speaker is our keynote speaker, who will speak for 20 minutes. And she has done a lot of work in the past few years, working with reindeer herders. So Heidrun is a climate researcher for quite a number of years at this stage. You've of extensive experience working with it, and not just with understanding climate models and where the data comes from, but also working with the practitioners and understanding their needs as well. And so I'm really delighted that today that you could join us and share with us your experiences and knowledge on this very important topic. So, Heidrun, it's my pleasure to welcome you onto the stage this morning to share with us some of your work. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, so thanks for the introduction, and thanks for having me in this session. I would like to talk to you about a topic that I've been working on for the past years, about how we can get from practitioners' knowledge to climate modeling and back. So how we can use climate model projections to provide relevant climate information to Arctic reindeer herding communities. So how did this start? It started with this idea that in environment-dependent livelihoods, not just in reindeer herding, that's true for others as well, there is like constant adaptation to external conditions. So you kind of go out, see what your environment looks like, and you adapt to that. So if you want to provide relevant and relatable climate change information to people in these livelihoods, you have to understand their operational environment to know what conditions are relevant for them. And the follow-up idea kind of was to spark thinking about adaptation strategies. So yeah, you do have strategies, they work in the current climate, they might not work in a future climate. So how do you get people to think about this? This kind of evolved into this three-step process that I won't go into detail. I just wanted to show it, like you have to first understand the operational environment and then find out what are the critical conditions for people, and then you go look for climate model information that can help you provide this, and then you go back to the people and present it to them, and this is like a kind of endless back and forth. It's like going in circles all the time, but that's, I think, the only way to get there. Like I said, this is like something that works for other environment-dependent livelihoods as well, but I will go with reindeer herders mostly from Finland as an example, because that's the group of people we had the most connections to, and we could like more or less easily talk to. So the first step, like I said, is about the understanding the operational environment of people. And in the project that I've worked in, this has been done in workshops with practitioners, so with reindeer herders. And my colleagues Sirpa Rasmus and Irina Wang have developed a set of cards to actually help doing this with elements of the operational environment provided. And so this is, if anybody is free to use this or adapt it to their needs, it can be found in the location indicated here. And then what this looked like before we had the nice set of cards, actually, they were handwritten in the beginning. is then people sat around on a big table, they had like this sheet of paper, everyone could choose from the cards, and then people placed it. This is all in Finnish, I don't understand it either. But the nice thing is like, up here there is the heart, sielu, like what makes up the heart of the livelihood, which is like people put traditional knowledge and community values in there. And then once you kind of have these maps of the operational environment, you can start to try and identify like these critical conditions throughout the year. This is an example that my colleague Teresa Komu made with herders in the southern part of the Finnish reindeer herding area. And it's just an example of like throughout the reindeer herding year conditions that are important to the people so that a year can be successful or like be a catastrophe. This depends, what this looks like depends on how people do their herding. And there's a nice paper on this if you're interested to go into detail in the differences by my colleague Rosa Laptander. And actually, once you you have this cycle that we're going to go for here, there are a lot of different elements in here that actually can't be done from climate modeling, I would say. So one of the things that struck us first are there are a number of things that are actually ecological modeling. So it's not something we can do from climate model output. Also, there is a lot of very descriptive things in here, like what's a hot summer, or what is warm conditions during rutting, right? So one of the first circles we did was like we went back to people and asked, what does this actually mean to you? Okay. So we kind of clarified, and then we went and tried to find the meteorological variables, like the climate model output that we would need to calculate the things that people were interested in. So there's temperature in there, and then there's things like clouds or wind speed or precipitation that you actually need to kind of calculate these indices. And I would like to show you a couple of examples of what this then looked like. Two are easy kind of temperature-based indices. This is the hot summers and thawing days in autumn. And then two more complex indices, rain on snow and ice crusts on bare ground, which is also called black ice. So how do you do this if you're a climate modeler, which is my background? You kind of look at what the observations look like. So this is basically days with temperatures above 0 degrees in October and November. And you can just count them, and then you make a climatological average, and it looks like this. And then you go and look for climate modeling data. In this case, this is like the global models that informed the last IPCC report. And then you can compare those two and see, well, they actually fit pretty well, even though, of course, the global models are rather coarse in resolution. So they don't get all the features. I click and nothing happens. Okay, anyways. And then what you also do as a climate modeler, right, you go and make a climate change signal. So basically, this is like the end of the century of one chosen climate future. Like this is SSP5 RCP 8.5 here. And you can see that the climate change signal basically is like where it's cold nowadays, it becomes especially, or the increase is especially big, and kind of you have this north-south gradient. But you can also see that like the grid cells are really pretty big. And if you go show this to a reindeer herder, they'll say, but there's like 3 herding districts in one of your grid cells, right? That's not helping much. So we went and looked for other climate data information, and of course there is the CORDEX data, so the coordinated regional downscaling experiments where you have high resolution regional models, and you do the same thing basically, right? So you look at the present day, and you can already see here that it has a lot more structure, right? Now people can actually like discern themselves from their neighbors in a way. And then again, you look at the climate change signal, which is somewhat different from the global climate change model, but has the same patterns that is in the global models. But still, if you show this to people, they are going to say, what does this look like where I live? So you end up making time series. And what we did is actually, there was a learning process as well. We started with showing the observations for the past decades, so people could relate to what we were showing them. So actually people would start discussing like this very cold winter here or a very warm winter in another at another time, and they kind of relate to the data that you're showing them. And then we again put in the observations, the models, and this is like the historical period again from the global models, and you can see that there is this distinct offset between the observations and the models, but the models kind of get the trend right, so the direction is correct. So then if you look at the future, what actually happens is you see that the increase in these thawing days till the end of the century depends on the global warming scenario you choose, and it can be like in the very warmest that we've been looking at, it can be up to 20 days, the increase. And then we tried something, we tried to visualize how we do climate change signals. So we kind of shifted this to make it easier to read, right? And then you see that kind of like by the end of the century, at least in Rovaniemi in Finland, like all of the days in this period will be thawing days. So there'll be no more freeze. But then what does that actually like mean to people? So we need a translation of this information into the context of reindeer herding if we want this to make sense to people. And that's not something I can do very well, because I'm not a reindeer herder. So fortunately, we have collaborators who can do these things for us. And I showed this to colleague Sanna Hast from Finnish Reindeer Herders Association, and she looked at it and said, so this means we'll be working in the wet and in the dark. If there's no more snow, it's even darker when the light levels are low. And like if there is no freezing, then the ground is wet. So it's hard to get to places, it is hard to corral your reindeer in. It makes working out in the field like a lot harder to people. And this is like I think the kind of message that you can actually convey to people. But it needs a lot of steps to get there. So this is one that I think worked pretty well, and we got a lot of good feedback that this is actually relevant to people. But, okay, now I do need the back button. No, anyway. So another thing that people were very interested in is hot summer days, because like reindeer are the winter animal in a way, right? So they don't like it if it's very warm. Very warm summers disturb their grazing peace, which means they go into the winter with a low body weight, which is like bad for everything. So here again we have the observation. So this is days in summer with maximum temperatures above 25 degrees, and we can already see just from this simple comparison that the general pattern is reflected well by the models, but the magnitude is not. So the models are a lot lower than what the observation says. And then if we look into the future projection, then we can see like in this southern area there is a very strong increase by more than 40 days in places, while in the north, where the reindeer are, the increase is still substantial, but not as bad. But again, this is like global model information, so we went for the regional models again, and here you can also see, like again, the pattern has a lot more fine-grained information here, which is good, but then if you look into the climate change signal, it looks like this. So it's like totally different from the signal of the global models. Which for a climate modeler is easy to explain. I understand why it is like that, but it's super complicated to explain that to like reindeer herders. So this is actually not something you can easily communicate to people. And then if we go forward and look at the time series again, this is the same structure as we had before, and then you put the models in, and then you see they basically say these days don't exist, while the observation says there have been like 12 of them on average in the past decade. So here, there's clearly something not working well. And then if you look into the future, you can see this increase. But actually what you also see is like, even in the warmest scenario at the end of the century, the value is below what's been observed in the past decade. So this is not something you can like show to people and explain to them. And also delta change is not working here because the models are just, there's something fundamentally wrong here in the way models represent these warm temperatures. So this is something where if we want to give information to people, we need to work on our models because this is not working. Okay, so these were like the easy things, like the just temperature-based things. If we go to more complex indices like rain on snow, so in this picture you can see like the ice layers that are potentially consequences of rain falling on snow and then refreezing, then things become even more complicated. So this is important to herders because it inhibits the reindeer digging through the snow, so then they can't feed. So actually, what do you need to calculate that? You need temperature, you need snow, and you need to know if precipitation is actually rain or snow, right? Because if it's snow, it doesn't matter. So then if you go and look for this data, you go to a place called the Earth System Grid Federation website, which has the climate model data. And then this website actually shows you how many simulations are available for what you want. So what you specify is like, I want daily data, and then you say the variable. So in this particular case, there are nearly 2,000 simulations available for temperature. And then I wanted snow, and it's like 100. Like, out of these 2,000 simulations, only 100 provide snow depth. So the alternative is to go to snow water equivalent, and then it gets somewhat better. Then it's like half of the simulations, but it's still only half, right? And then the last one you need is like the precipitation, which is, so in the end, it means from all the information you could potentially have, only half is available to actually calculate rain on snow from the models. Why? Because people don't provide it, because people don't have confidence in it, because people don't know that anybody would look for it, right? So there's a communication issue here, and you can make that worse by looking for black ice. So black ice is similar to rain on snow without the snow. So you have frozen ground, and then it rains onto the ground, and it forms these massive ice layers that you can also very nicely slip on. And it kind of means the reindeer can't get to the ground lichen at all, because they can't dig through that. Or if the layer is not so thick, they eat the frozen lichen with all the water, and it makes them have stomach aches. So similar setup as before, like we need temperature, we need snow, we need precipitation, and then we would have to know if the ground's frozen. And here, you've seen those numbers before, that was like half, but like only 15% of all the available simulations have soil temperatures, because people don't put them, people don't have confidence in them, people don't know that anybody's going to look for them. And this kind of really, like from this beginning, from this circle in the beginning, you kind of can cross out more than half of these indices because you just can't do them in a confident way. So that brings me to my conclusions. I think the modeling we do needs to be tailored to user needs in different ways than we do it at the moment. We kind of still make climate model simulations for climate modelers in a way. So I think specific user groups have specific needs and variables. I don't think that's something new. It's just, it came out to me in a very prominent way when I started doing this. And I think we really need to include the users already in the development process for the models, so which variables are interesting to them, and also in the setup of the simulations and the way we actually save our output, so we can actually meet users' needs. And then we also need a more targeted view on model performance, right? Because like looking at temperature averages would potentially tell you that our models aren't doing badly. But then looking at something very specific, like days with temperatures above 25 degrees, tells you that this isn't represented well. But you can only see that if you look for that particularly. And the other point is that like less commonly used variables like snow or soil temperatures are even harder to get from models, and it is very hard to evaluate them because very often we don't have good observational data to actually see if the things that we would compute actually make sense. Right, that's it, and with that I'm open for questions.
Thank you very much, Heidrun. That's very interesting work, and some really nice recommendations for more work that we need to do and should address. Any questions for Heidrun from the audience? Yeah.
Hello, I'm
There's a mic, yeah.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Sara Salastia from University of Oulu, Finland. I'm a student. I was just, is there a quick answer? I'm very interested in climate models. I'm studying physical geography. Is there a quick answer to why is the global model different to the regional one that we were talking about when talking about the hot summers?
Is that a quick answer? So basically,
if I know stuff about climate models, but
yeah, then
still
then the answer is actually pretty easy, because like if you have a regional model, it needs to be driven by a global model, and the choices of the global models you make, you have to think about this, about why you do the downscaling and what's the target in choosing the global model, and that's not taken into account in the way it should be, I think. So basically, if you chose the global models that drove these regional models and only made a climate change signal from them, it would probably be a lot closer to what the regional models tell you, because they get this information in away from the global models. So choosing your driving models is super important if you want to kind of reflect what the global models have been saying.
Very nice. Any more questions? Yes, Michael. There was a mic.
Yeah, Michael Schulz, Norwegian Met Office. I think this number of variables is a bit treacherous. I mean, these models have really used or done sensitivity simulations on doubling dust or doubling VOC or doubling DMS emissions, and you don't want the...
No, that's not the choice I made. This
what
is just
the choice?
This is just really the historical simulations have been blown up, and of course there are in this number there are several of the large ensembles that have been happening in CMIP6. Yeah. So you could argue that they are kind of repetitions that just try to look at internal variability. So in that sense, it's not like there are really like 2,000 different models available. That's why I said simulations.
Okay. Historical, but still 200 is quite a bit. If you have 200 simulations with surface snow gaps, it's quite a bit.
Yes, that's because like one of the big ensembles in the setup is CAN ESM, which provided a lot of data from the large ensemble that they did. So they are like maybe half of these simulations. That's true. Yes.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Heidrun. That's very nice. Our next speaker is Rasmus Bennestad, and Rasmus is a senior scientist and head of model and climate analysis at the Norwegian Meteorological Institute. He also co-leads the Arctic Monitoring and Assessment Program's Climate Expert Group, and he's a point of contact for the World Climate Research Programme's Coordinated Regional Downscaling Experiment, which Heidrun just mentioned very nicely. And so it's a pleasure to have you here today to share your insights and experiences with us on working with climate model data. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Priscilla. Good morning. I will present a synthesis of downscaled temperatures for the Barents region that may benefit impact studies. I'll be coming from a different angle to Heidrun. And this study is together with Julia Lutz and Oskar Langgren, Kjetil Isaksen and Kaisa Parding and Andreas Dobler. So these are my colleagues in my group. So what we want to do is to provide useful and reliable and robust climate information on local scales. And for instance, this shows one instrument on a place. So basically we want to take information that the global climate models, which are our primary tool to look into the future and say something about this. And one way of doing this is to do something we call downscaling, because the global climate models are able to provide a large-scale picture, but not local details that we need for this. So, and these station data we use them both for calibrating the results as well as evaluating the model results as well. So one example here is from Svalbard Airport, and you can see we look at large ensembles. So we look at this is the latest run of global climate models, several hundred global climate models, GCM's global climate models. And the black symbols here are the winter temperature, actually annual temperature at Svalbard. And then you have different bands following different emission scenarios here, where that shows the spread of these models, and you can see that they do quite well. They reproduce the past changes, and we need to know if they can reproduce the past before we can say something about the future. So evaluation is very, very important. And also we can look at various emissions to see like what does it make to cut the emissions in the future. We also want to see if it makes a big difference if we look at the previous generation of global climate models and the present. So this is the previous one. It's called RCP. That's the CMIP5 in technical language, and this is the corresponding in the latest run. But we see that they more or less do the same thing. There's slight differences here, and I think some of the differences you showed were like the Cordex data is from the previous version from RCP5, whereas the CMIP6 is a new set of runs, so there are different sets of model simulations. And then also we want to use several approaches to make sure that they give the same answers, because they're based on very different assumptions. So this is empirical statistical downscaling, which is very cheap to do. I can downscale a lot of models, but also the Cordex data that you showed are more dynamical downscale, which are very heavy to run. So you have to make a small selection of models. So here we can compare we call them RCMs, as a region climate models, to see if they describe the same thing as the statistical downscaling, because they're based on different assumptions that have their different weaknesses and strengths and weaknesses. And we see that they do actually follow each other. So we have quite strong confidence that our model results are good for making projections and describe the future. So now the question is, how do we make use of this data, right? So that is a big sort of concern we're looking at, how to make use of this information. So here's one thing is that if you look at it depends. You have to ask yourself what information has been used before to study climate impacts or assist climate change adaptation, and then we have to look at where do we actually have the observations, because that's where we can evaluate the models. That's where we can do the calibration. As you showed, you can get data for all over the place, but we don't know exactly the quality of it. So we have places where we have measurements that can be used for evaluation. But also, like in the past, and you showed it, how has it been used, and why has it been used the way it has been used? To ask these questions is really important to make sure that people use the information the best way. And also, we had to ask the question, has all available and relevant information been used before? And probably not. So this is a discussion we have to have cross-disciplinary to try to make the best out of it. And we have some examples from Tromsø, from CLEAN projects, where we applied the downscaling to get the local perspective of climate change. And one thing, the obvious thing is to ask, why do we need downscaling, right? Why not use the global climate models? Just to have this discussion, to have this understanding where the numbers come from. And then also, when we look at the downscale data or model data, what does that information actually mean? I think people have lots of understanding or interpretations of what these numbers actually mean. They're not the same as observations. And then also we have these climate services where data portals, and people ask, which models should I use? And when people ask that, I know there's a big problem, because we're not talking to each other. What the climate is basically weather statistics. So we should be able to provide statistics based on all the models to get some robust information, rather than picking one model that, if you pick a different model, you get a different answer, right? So we had to provide guidelines for local climate information, and also have this co-production of knowledge by asking all these questions, so that we understand each other. And we had some collaborations with biologists, and that we didn't quite understand each other. So we need to speak more together, spend more time together to try to understand each other. So I think information and statistics is important to provide. So to me, climate is weather statistics, and statistical properties are surprisingly predictable. That's why you have Las Vegas, that's why you have lottery and so on. We can put a number on probabilities, but we don't know exactly what the outcome is. And this is like the dice here. We know that the probability of rolling at 6 is 1/6, but we don't know if we will roll it next time, right? We're not playing dice, but we can estimate the probabilities of getting various outcomes, and that we can do in a robust fashion. And then we can use these probabilities and use something we call weather generators to make daily data based on these. And this is one example of the statistics. So basically, we have this distribution of temperatures, and what we really want to know is how these distributions change, rather than just like what is it going to be on a certain date. So we're looking at both, rather than traditional time series from starters, we can get that too. We look at the statistical probabilities, which are more predictable, and we can look at, say, magnitudes or number of events. So rather than looking at a temperature and then asking how many days above zero, we can look at how many days above zero each year and look at the statistics of that rather than from day, but also like duration and also the spatial extent as well. So by that, I will thank you for your attention, because I only had 10 minutes and have 1 minute for questions.
Thank you very much. Very nice talk. We have time for 1 or 2 questions for Rasmus. No burning questions? No? Maybe I'll... Eric? Yeah, go ahead. No, be my guest, please.
While the audience is waiting, you mentioned guidelines for using climate data. Do you have some best practices you would recommend to users?
Yes, so it's talking to people who provide the numbers and try to understand where it comes from, not just take the numbers at face value. I'm involved in something called European Climate Research Alliance, ECRA, where we try to write a white paper on this, how it's being done in different countries. There are some at the climate services that we have, but I think we need to work on that. And as it has to be 2 ways, so it's not just me telling you how to use the numbers, but also users to tell what they need. So it has to be a compromise. And I heard one story from the Bay region in California, where they had a group sitting together so you follow the whole chain from one to the other. We have one project called Springs on Climate and Diarrhea, where we try to work on this. So it's still work in progress.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Rasmus. And our next speaker is Ronja. It's a pleasure to welcome you to the stage. Ronja's a project leader with the WWF Arctic program and supports its mission by providing technical knowledge and project management skills. She has extensive experience in work in invasive species in the Arctic with the Norwegian Polar Institute, so that's really nice to see. And your expertise are in biology with a focus on human impacts. So I'm really looking forward to hearing your talk, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks so much for this opportunity. As said, I'm not a climate scientist. I'm one of these ecologists who need to speak with climate scientists. And I'm presenting a collaboration work of colleagues from WWF, namely Melanie Lancaster, and colleagues from CARMA, the Circum-Arctic Ranger for Adaptation and Management Network. That's Don Russell and Anne Gunn. So we are off to a rapid start. If it ever switches. I only have 8 minutes, but I want to start with a key message for you to remember. and that is that for us in the conservation realm, climate data is incredibly helpful to develop bracketing scenarios. And these kind of bracketing scenarios, what are the options that could be in the future, can help us to inform policymakers and to develop targeted and anticipatory mitigation plans. Well, now, the Arctic is rapidly warming and it's only speeding up. We know it is urgent to plan for and act on impacts on Arctic biodiversity. Caribou are a keystone species in the Arctic, and Heidrun already explained it very nicely, how important they are. They are not only, and I'm now speaking about wild caribou, they have an immense cultural significance for the indigenous peoples of the Arctic. They're important for livelihoods, they're important ecosystem engineers. And Heidrun also already mentioned how incredibly impacted these animals are by climate. So in the summer, if it's too hot, the forage quality goes down, the insect harassment goes up, they don't have enough time to feed. In the winter, we have rain and snow events that make it difficult to feed. And whenever you can't feed, you might starve. And there has been catastrophic declines in some populations in the last decades. So the scale of emissions of greenhouse gases will determine the futures. However, as we're looking at the Arctic, it's not one Arctic, there's regional differences. And if we want to actually give concrete or co-develop with others concrete mitigation plans, we need to understand or have at least a basic understanding of what are the regional differences that we can expect and how can we act upon them. So it's important to improve our understanding of these influences, and then we can plan how we will manage into the future. Sorry. The future can be anywhere in this realm. And we have picked, together with climate scientists, one I'm sorry. We've developed one very optimistic and one very pessimistic scenario that is based on SSP1 and SSP2 5 pathways. And we have, this is not ideal, sorry. Well, we have picked one strong climate change scenario, one with very much like an optimistic projection, and we have taken 2 time points, one that is at 2050 and one that's at 2100.
Just do like this and he will move forward.
Okay. Yes, thank you. Okay, so pessimistic, optimistic, and I can have a click already. And we can just go to the next slides where we are looking at geographically representative herds. So we've picked 3 geographically representative herds, and in a way they are geographically representative, giving us coastal and interior climates and a variety of bedrocks. So we have the Central Arctic herd that has a coastal climate, that's here in bright green, and relative calcareous bedrock. Then we have the Bathurst herd here in turquoise that has an interior climate, bedrock dominated, and therefore very sparse and acidic tundra vegetation, and the Taimyr herd that has a low-lying topography with silty soils. We've then used, and I could have the next slide, and I can have the next things all coming up, next 4 things. We've used the approach of a vulnerability assessment, which is an IPCC recognized framework, to first look at the sensitivity, how are climate and vital rates connected. Next one. To look at the exposure, what kind of climates will herds be exposed to, and to look at the potential impacts. How will this affect the body weight of cows and calves, the pregnancy and the survival? And then in the last step, we are kind of expanding this into adaptive capacity. Next slide, please, and I would like to have the whole diagram up. That's coming on the next slide. We've done this by using a caribou cumulative effects model, which links these climate data to ecological data throughout a model that brings these together then into a protein and energy model. And we have used CMIP monthly temperature data from these regions that have been extracted for us by collaborators of the University of... It works again? Yes, okay. By collaborators of the University of Bergen, and have linked this then to the activity and also brought in vegetation data. Looking at the exposure, one of our main findings, you can see the current daily maximums as the gray dotted lines, is if we're looking at the optimistic and the pessimistic scenario, we can see that all three herds are projected to experience mean daily temperature exceeding historic maximum temperatures quite quickly. Then how does this change in exposure change how herds are developing? Well, it's impacting rate of pregnancy and the calf mortality. And all three herds are projected to decline, both under the optimistic and under the pessimistic scenario, except initially the Central Arctic herd. And how would this affect herd sizes if we are adding these kind of climate stressors on the dynamics that the herds already have? So we are knowing that some herds are declining, some herds are actually growing. We've used a 10-year simulation to add this kind of climate stress in the different scenarios, and looking at the 2100 pessimistic scenario based on current herd sizes, all three herds are projected to decline, and the Taimyr herd shows the strongest decline. And that's probably based on the very strong decline that the herd is currently in already. So, how to sum it up? We do see strong regional effects, and with the Central Arctic herd projected to be least affected, and we're expecting that this would be similar for other herds that also summer on the coast on sedimentary substrates. The Basses herd is projected to experience the highest rate of decline. That one is exposed to the very harsh continental climate and frequent droughts and is on acidic bedrock. Again, we think one can extrapolate that to some extent. The Taimyr herd shows intermediate effects of contradicting climate but sedimentary bedrock. Through management, we can influence how herds fare. Management usually affects how herds, or like we are trying to influence the survival rate, either by regulating how many animals are taken out or by regulating predators. And depending on which herd we are talking about, we have different options there. For example, the Bathurst herd, even though it's projected to do worst, it is already under a very strong management regime. So we are really worried looking whenever we are taking into consideration these climate projections. One really important way of how caribou can adapt to climate is by moving through the landscape based on the annual and seasonal variations. So one of the things that we need to do to actually manage these kind of impacts anticipatory is to keep landscapes open and connected. Again, we also need to proactively develop concrete mitigation plans That said, we currently think that only the optimistic scenario can actually be mitigated through measures. So we really need to strive to minimize our CO2 emissions so that we can stick as close to the most optimistic scenario as possible. I'm an ecologist, but I know that the data have a lot of caveats. We only used summer temperatures. We only used CMIP data, which is relatively coarse. The CMIP data uses mean temperatures. Caribou are also very much influenced through maximum temperatures, and we cannot take into account ecological surprises. So this is a start, but still, using a bracketing approach and working together with scientists allows us to create the scenarios, start the conversations, and start thinking together of how can we co-manage, how can we develop those plans. I'm very sorry for taking more time than needed, but it was a little bit of a challenge to get going.
Thank you very much. We have time for a question if you
All
want.
right.
Yeah. Thank you very much. And thanks, that was an excellent talk, and you really managed the technical issues very well. So, any questions from the audience? Yeah, Hydrin.
Yeah, thanks for the very nice presentation. I was wondering, you mentioned like keeping landscapes open because like the main adaptation strategy that caribou have and also that herders have is movement, right?
Yes.
But land use pressure in the Arctic is not going to go down in the future. So how do you kind of figure that into your recommendations?
I think that we are aware that land use pressure is not going down, but we are still going to advocate for taking the migration routes and ranges of caribou into special consideration. And Gunn and Don Russell, who've been working with me on this project and who have been, frankly said, instrumental because they are the ones who are running the caribou cumulative effects model. They've done a lot of work in looking at how different linear infrastructures, such as pipelines, are influencing different Arctic herds. And one can really see the strong effects. So for us, this is an important takeaway that, yes, we have to argue against linear infrastructure that can disrupt migrations, and we have to try to plan everything in a way that has the least impact possible. We know that we can't always completely keep things completely infrastructure, linear infrastructure free. However, if we're looking at the Canadian and Alaska North, there is still a lot more space without linear infrastructure that still does allow for movement and for permeability. And where possible, even when we have infrastructure, we need to plan for permeability, for example, by having pauses in traffic in the important migration times, things like this.
Super. Thank you very much. All right. And our next speaker is Styra, who is a first-year PhD candidate. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's our pleasure. So you're working on climate adaptation at Hans University of Applied Sciences.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, I'm looking forward to hearing your talk.
Thank you very much. So we've had all modelers, ecologists, and now we have a social scientist. So I think the organizers are already doing a great job of bringing us together. So I would like to talk to you about the local climate change narratives, and specifically emplace climate imaginaries, which was one of my key concepts. So indeed, I work for the Hans University of Applied Sciences, but also at the Arctic Center at the University of Groningen. So we've already discussed in previous presentations that there is this multitude of futures. There's all these different scenarios that you can work towards through either scientific models that are, of course, like data-driven, but also people's local experiences. Everybody here in this room has different ideas of what they think is a perceivable future or is a preferable future. So there are all these kind of different futures that we have to work towards. And I think the challenge is to connect connect these scientific model futures and these scenarios that we're developing with people's experience and ideas of the future. So climate change is not just an environmental phenomenon, it's also deeply social and cultural, and this is a very important aspect, I think, of how we look at climate change. Because the way that people tend to experience climate change and also interpret how it is through their place. It's through where they live, where they work, where they do all their parts of life. And it is this place that is necessary to fully understand how you can create strategies for adaptation strategies, but even mitigation strategies. So an emplaced understanding in these things is highly necessary. So that brings me to one of the key concepts in my research, which is emplaced climate imaginaries. And this is really about the ways that people are thinking about the future in the context of climate change. And this is how they envision the climate change impacting their place, but also how they make sense of it. And it's really rooted in cultural ideas, social values, also biases that people have. So this is all part of the ways that we start to envision our future in the light of climate change. So I look at two case studies. They're both river communities. One is closer to the equator, which is in northern Peru, and the other is in northern Norway. And I will get to why I'm making this comparison in a little bit as well. So in northern Peru, I focus on this area, which is the Piura and Tumbes area. And as you can see in this image as well, it's severely impacted by the impacts of the El Niño phenomenon. So this is the warming of the Pacific Ocean, which is, it has global impacts, but it really hits hard on the coast of northern Peru. So they have actually already, because of this, a history of environmental shifts. They've always had to face either this increase or this decrease, and then, of course, the environmental shocks that come with it. So during El Niño, that might be extreme droughts in this specific area, and during La Niña, which is the opposite version, it's extreme flooding because of heavy rainfall. So as you can see, they're heavily impacted by this. Well, we've already had some lovely presentations that also discuss the Arctic. So there it's, of course, more gradual, now long-term impacts of climate change, which is, of course, exponentially increasing at the moment. And this is creating more slow onset impacts often. So this is like ecosystem changes, the melting of the ice. So there is a difference that I'm very interested in my research in between northern Peru and northern Norway. And for Norway, I'm focusing on the Alta River. So I just came back from doing some fieldwork in Peru, so I would like to take you along for that for a little bit. So we've done deep mapping with students from universities in the area in a climate cafe setting. So climate cafe is something that we do a lot at my University of Applied Sciences, which is kind of a participatory research method. So what we try to do is we go into the field with stakeholders. In this case, they were the students of the universities. And as you can see on the first image, we collect a lot of different data about the quality of the water in the river, for instance, heat stress measurements, biodiversity mapping. So really just to get a data-driven understanding of the impacts of climate change on the river. But then the students also get tools to participate in storytelling with other local stakeholders. So for instance, they are discussing with a local water treatment plant. They're talking to people working at the dam, but also the villagers in the village downstream of the river that are severely impacted by drought regulations that the government has installed upon them. And then at the end of the week, they have to combine everything in what we call a deep map. So the idea is that a deep map is to go beyond just geographical mapping of a place, but creating more of a narrative map of a place. So you don't only add the data that we've collected during the Climate Cafe, but you're also adding memories that you yourself may have, that other people that you talk to may have of the river, certain ideas that they have. This can be about the future, but also often it relates to the past that people have experienced. It's emotions that you might feel. So one of the things we do is a sensory walk. What do you experience? How does it make you feel? What do you hear? What do you feel? And combining this all into this deep map of the area. And yeah, so this is an example one of the groups made. So you see that they put in a lot of quotes. They're drawing the animals that we've seen throughout the week. And they also put their ideas of a perfect future for the river in it. I still have to start analyzing this, so I hope that I get to share the results with you at some other time. But yeah, so far it's been very interesting to see where the students focus on. Some of them are really focusing on biodiversity and almost going to a future in which we actually go back to a past in which there is a very increased biodiversity. But others actually implemented a lot of mitigation strategies in their perfect future vision because they wanted to just get rid of the dam and have other kinds of energy systems, for instance. So now I have to start preparing for doing similar field work in northern Norway. So I'm very curious to see if the what kind of differences I will find in these contrasting climate tempos that I've explained previously. And of course, like we're getting close, like it's the Arctic versus the equator, basically. So how do these different environmental contexts also shape people's ideas of the future and how climate change is going to impact this? I do expect to find some common themes because in the end, climate change is of course a global phenomenon, even if it has different local impacts. So yeah, then I hope to find out how these lived experiences of peoples and their ideas, how they relate to the scientific models and the regional models about climate impact futures for the two regions. So yeah, I think it's necessary to add these stories to the scientific models. It's been mentioned in previous presentations as well, but they can really ground scientific models into people's lived experiences. And in the end, if you do it like this, you can create the more effective, community-driven, really bottom-up adaptation strategies. Also mitigation strategies, they are also often heavily impacting the land people live on. So it's really necessary to have this community-driven idea of what can we do to adapt to and mitigate climate change. So I hope that in the end my research, like it was mentioned, it's early stage for me, so I'm hoping that at the end I can contribute to creating place-based climate adaptation frameworks that really integrate people's cultural values, social values with the local climate data that we have. So thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to some questions.
Thank you. That was a really nice and very interesting talk. Do we have any questions? We have a time for 1 or 2 questions if people have any, or maybe some feedback or suggestions or ideas on your research is early, so maybe it's helpful to get some comments.
Yeah, that's more than welcome. So
Very nice. Yeah. Do we have a microphone, maybe?
Yeah. Hi. I just had a question. I was wondering, just the locations. Do you think that your data could also be influenced in the future if you pick areas that don't have, you know, kind of like that obvious biodiversity when we think of locations with that, whether it's Peru or Norway? I guess coming from someone who's like lived in a country where that's the norm that I learn about in areas like that. And so like picking a location that's, you know, not obvious to people on what the climate and the environment is, do you think that that would shape their responses to how they envision the environment going forward in the future? Or picking areas that aren't exactly coastal or water-based, do you think that would influence it?
yeah, so my initial answer before you added coastal or water would be the Netherlands, actually. But that is, of course, very rooted in being a coastal country way below sea level and everything. But I do hope that we get to translate some of these findings into the Dutch context as well. because there a lot of these things are indeed less obvious. We're a very urbanized country. We're fighting for every square inch, basically, to see, do we need housing on this? Do we need other public spaces on this? And the environment is unfortunately always last on that list. So I do hope that we can create like a comparison, or at least lessons learned for areas like the Netherlands as well. But then if you leave out the coastal and river community idea, then I still think that the whole adding the local narratives to these local climate data as well is necessary to create robust strategies for the future. So it will work in other areas as well. I think that would be my thoughts. Yes. So thanks for the question.
Very nice. I think we have time for one more quick question. If yeah.
Thank you for that presentation. I was wondering if I know that you're early in the analysis, but I was wondering if you could share some of the strategies that stakeholders propose for adaptation or mitigation strategies.
Mm-hmm. I love that greening is always one that the students are very favored for, which is in especially the Piura area that I work in northern Peru, not something that's ordinary to do. It's also it's a dry area as well. So I think these are also perceptions that people get from other areas perhaps. It's a desert area, so there's not a whole lot of green going on. But I love that greening is still one of the main ideas that they often propose, especially because it has such a broad impact. It's not just adaptation, it's also mitigation. So I think it's so great to see that the students, they're also all like very young, just like early 20s, sometimes late teens, that they already have very good understanding of this combination of mitigating and adapting to, and how to combine these two. So I find that very, very cool to see, actually. Yeah.
Very nice. Thank you very much, Sarah.
Thank you so much.
I look forward to seeing how this progresses. Very interesting. Our next speaker is Aidan Hunter. Aidan is an ecological modeler with a special interest in polar marine planktonic systems. He has a PhD in fishery statistics and has been doing a lot of work in recent years in ecosystems modeling, particularly statistical components of fitting models to observations. Aidan, the floor is yours.
Thanks. So this work on the contribution of dipods and copepods to the Southern Ocean lipid pump is part of two separate projects called BioPol and PolarRes. Both of these projects have their own websites shown here where you can find lots more detail. This slide just distills the vital information onto the one page, and my contribution to these projects is highlighted in the points shown in bold. BioPol is a large UK-funded, multidisciplinary, multi-institute project with many different research aims that can be summarised as an investigation into biogeochemical and ecological processes at both poles. And my work on BioPol involves modelling a vital part of polar ecosystems, copepods, and their ability to transport carbon to deep waters and store it there for long periods of time. PolarRes is an EU-funded project involving many different research institutes collaborating to enhance the resolution and the reliability of climate models at the poles. PolarRes has adopted the so-called model storyline approach to assimilating climate model outputs rather than simply averaging over many different models. And my work will use their enhanced climate models to simulate copepod distributions and how their distributions may be impacted by future climate change. So what are copepods and why do they matter? Copepods are tiny zooplanktonic animals that are extraordinarily abundant throughout the world's oceans. They are thought to outnumber insects, with an estimated total global biomass approximately 10 times that of humans. They have a complex life cycle of development through 12 distinct forms, starting with 6 naupliar forms, followed by 6 copepodite stages, where C6 is the adult form. In the polar regions, copepods survive the winter by accruing large quantities of lipid in their bodies, which you can see here. This lipid may be up to 70% of their body mass, and it's vital for their survival over the winter time, but it's also crucial to the wider ecosystem because by feeding on phytoplankton, copepods provide a link between primary productivity and the higher trophic levels. So I'm particularly interested in the carbon storage potential of the seasonal lipid pump. On the left is a basic schematic of this process. Copepods feed in surface waters during the short productive season, and they store large quantities of carbon in their body in the form of the lipids that we've just seen. After fattening up, they descend to depths greater than 500 meters, and sometimes as deep as 2,000 meters or more, where they overwinter in a hibernating state called diapause. And during this time, which may be as long as 8 or 9 months, the copepods are basically inactive, but they're burning through their stored lipid and breathing it out into the deep waters as carbon dioxide. And that carbon dioxide may remain in deep waters for hundreds of years. And this process is the seasonal lipid pump. And given the sheer quantity of copepods in the ocean, the lipid pump is thought to be a significant contributor to carbon dioxide storage. The lipid pump has been quantified in the well-studied Arctic species, but less is known about the Antarctic, so I'm addressing that through data analyses and species distribution modelling. So I've spent considerable time sourcing, cleaning, and collating all the Southern Ocean copepod abundance records that I could find into one great big table, and that'll be published as a standalone data product upon completion of the Biopole project. So on the left are some of the main data sources that have gone into this table, although there are several more. And on the right is the distribution of all of the abundance records that I have, though these vary in their usefulness for modelling the lipid pump. So this is just an overview of what the abundance data actually look like. On the left, we see the temporal distribution of the records for 4 lipid-storing diaposing species called Calanoides acutus, Calanus propinquus, Calanus simillimus, and Ring Calanus gigas. And we can see straight away that most of the records are from the 1980s onwards. And that's fine for our purposes because the detailed environmental information that we need as explanatory variables in our models span a similar time period. Of note, however, is the large number of records that have not been resolved to copepodite stage. And this matters because it's the copepodite stage is C5, and with C4 and C5 that accrue lots of lipid and transport that to depth where it can be stored over long periods of time. On the right, we see the seasonal and depth distributions of the records, and unsurprisingly for a polar ocean, there's very few winter samples, but hopefully we have enough in the critical times of spring and autumn where the animals are ascending from and descending into diapause. And we can also see that most of the records are from the upper 300 meters, but we do have sufficient very deep water samples to generate pictures of the seasonal depth distributions, like this. Sigrid Schnack-Shields' legacy of Southern Ocean zooplankton samples are a data goldmine that we can use to create descriptive models of seasonal depth distributions. And we can also estimate the lipid pump carbon export, but only really at the measurement times and locations, not at ocean scales, just from these data alone. So what we're looking at here is the depth distribution of Calanoides acutus over a single year. And this plot is grouped by copepodite stage. So we can see that the early stage copepodites, the C1s and C2s, only occur in surface waters and only during the spring and the summer. The C3s, they do appear, some of them, to attempt to diapause. They sink down to deeper waters, but they very likely perish at depth due to having insufficient lipid to survive the winter. And if that's the case, then that's just another contribution to deep water carbon storage. The C4s and 5s are what we're really interested in. They're lipid rich, and they transport all of that carbon down to between 500 and 1,000 meters to overwinter. And when they burn through that lipid, they're breathing out the carbon dioxide, and that's the process that we call the lipid pump. Interestingly, the C6s are seen to emerge at depth, indicating that the transition into adulthood occurs in deep waters. And if that transition also incurs a high lipid cost, then this is yet another contribution to deep water carbon storage. So moving from descriptive to explanatory models allows us to quantify lipid pump carbon transport at ocean scales. By relating seasonal distribution patterns observed from the in situ abundance data that we've just seen to the copepod's environment, we may estimate abundance and seasonal lipid transport as a function of environment. And this is where the PolarRes high-resolution climate models come into play. And we can see a few example plots of these over here. So I'm building species distribution models to explain variability in measured copepod abundances in terms of a large suite of environmental variables. And these are provided as 5-day mean values from 1990 or thereabouts to present day. And after designing and fitting the models, they will inform us which environmental variables are the strongest predictors of patterns in seasonal depth distributions. And the fitted models will also allow us to estimate abundance, as well as lipid pump carbon export at ocean scales. So once the species distribution models are fitted to climate model hindcasts, we can then use them to predict copepod abundances and the future of the lipid pump. So this should be a relatively simple process, fingers crossed, of plugging high-resolution climate data into our fitted distribution models for copepods. And this will produce forecasts of ocean-scale copepod biomass and the 3D lipidscape running out to about 2100. And by using climate model predictions that adhere to different future climate storylines, we may evaluate the climate change impacts on the lipid pump carbon storage pathway, whilst accounting for variability in potential future climates. And finally, all of this work, these model assessments, I plan to conduct both for the Antarctic and the Arctic copepod communities. I could talk at length about all of this stuff, so if you have any questions, please feel free to look me up over the next few days.
We have time for one quick question, if anybody has one. No? Going once, going twice? Gone. All right.
Oh,
Thank you very much, Aidan. I have some questions, but I'll catch you at the tea break. Yes, so our next speaker is Elizabeth. And Elizabeth is a senior scientist in the fish health department at NFIMA. Her research interests include how climate change will affect aquaculture in general and fish health in particular. So I'm very interested to hear your talk and see how you're using climate model data. So.
Thank you for. No.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for the nice introduction and thanks for staying to listen to my talk. Will it come?
It should.
Yeah, he's working on it.
Okay.
Try now.
Yeah, so I've been working with climate change and the impact of climate change on aquaculture for 10 years. And today I will present some work that we have done on diversification. The work is done by a number of people from a wide range of different institutes. So we have tried to combine biological scientists with climatologists and also included stakeholders. So there's a lot of work behind this, what I will present to you now. So diversification means introduction of new species in aquaculture. Like in Norway, we have mostly monoculture with Atlantic salmon. But introducing more species is what we call diversification. And it's suggested as one of the main adaptation strategies to make aquaculture more resilient to climate change. This is because different species, they have different preferences when it comes to environmental changes like salinity, oxygen, and temperature. And this may make aquaculture more flexible to adapt to changing conditions. However, it will take between 10, 15, 20 years to commercialize species for aquaculture. So thinking about this, we wanted to see if we start commercializing species now, how will they fit into the environment in 20 years or more? Because diversification is one of the buzzwords used in aquaculture to combat climate change, but very little work has been done on actual climate changes when it comes to the different species. So the first thing we did was to look into the climate projections from IPCC, and we have seen this several times during the day, so I will just go through that. We picked the low emission scenario, the moderate emission scenario, and the high emission scenarios when we looked into these temperature differences. And these graphs, they show temperature at 5 meters depth, and you can obviously see the differences between the low, moderate, and the high, with the low being the so-called utopic scenario with the very little changes, moderate increasing to the mid-century before we have an effect of reduced emissions, and the high scenario, which will just continue to increase in temperatures. And we analyzed these scenarios in 4 different regions of Norway, what we call south, west, north, and in the Arctic. And you can also see the obvious differences here, that in the south you will have a temperature increase from around 10 degrees to 13 degrees, while in the Arctic the temperature will increase from 5, 6 degrees till 9 degrees. So depending on the scenario or the region you are located, the temperature changes will of course be different. Then we needed to select the species that we wanted to look into, and then we went to Aquaplan Niva's report from 2019, where they have selected species with the commercial interesting potential for aquaculture. So we selected 34 species in total. It included 17 fish species, 6 mollusks, 5 crustaceans, 3 seaweed, 1 echinoderm, and 1 tunicate. And for all these species, we needed to know what are their biological limits, what are their temperature preferences. So this was quite hard work because there is not much information out there. But we managed to find some settings for all of the species that we selected. And it's difficult to find maximum and minimum temperatures, and for aquaculture, it's the optimum temperature of the species that is interesting. That's when the species thrives and grows and feels okay in the net pens or in the farming settings. So here's an example from Atlantic salmon, how we did it. For Atlantic salmon, between 8 and 14 degrees is kind of the optimal range where it grows the quickest and thrives. So we call this the optimal point. And then we have the flanking temperatures with decreased temperatures or increased temperatures that will both make life challenging for this species. And then we had to make an index so that we could measure these biological terms up to and compare it to the temperature changes and the climate models. So we made a challenging condition index, which means that we had these settings with a high CCI, which means that the farmers take high precautions. This is a limit where the temperature is set near to the optimum temperature of the species, and temperature alone is not a risk factor for the animal. Then we have the medium CCI, which could be a risk factor if temperature in combination with other stress factors occurs. And then we had a setting called low CCR, which means that the farmer has low precaution settings, and temperature alone might be a challenge for the species that they farm. It's complicated, but it looks like this. Each of these blocks represent 1 year, and it shows the years from 2025 till 2035. And here we have used the low CCI settings. And each blue and red line represent challenging days in these settings. So if we increase the challenging condition index, you can see that the number of challenging days will increase. So this is a measure that the farmers can use or government can use to decide how many challenging days farmers can handle or how they can experience this. And this also this can also say something about how much technology you will need, for example, to combat these changes. Is it possible to farm these animals under that many challenging conditions? So we did this for all of the species, and we have huge tables showing the complexity behind this. This table shows the fish species from the 34 species, 80 years in time, with a moderate CCI level. This table also showed the 3 different scenarios, and we did this for all the different settings, so there's a lot of information to go into here to find out what kind of challenges each of these species may experience in the future. So here's an example from Atlantic salmon again, and I often use salmon as an example because we have so much information on salmon farming, so that's one of the reasons why I picked this as an example. So here you can see the different climate scenarios, the low, medium, and the high. And this is the colored dot, the lighter dots are is today, and the darker dots are in 80 years' time, so it's a change here. And you can see that today we have around 45 challenging days in the south. We have some troubles in the south with salmon, and this is the number of challenging days related to temperature. But in 80 years of time with the SSP 8.5, you will have a doubling of challenging days in these regions. Equally, if you look at spotted wolffish in the Arctic, if you farm it today, you will have 50 challenging days now, but you will have 155 days with the high climate scenario in the future. So to sum up, we have seen that challenging condition index, that can be a useful method to evaluate how many challenging days or how difficult it will be to farm different species under climate change. We have also seen that climate change will give rise to different challenges depending on the species that we look at and the regions in Norway or where you want to farm it. And I must stress with this work that we need to involve climate change in the discussion when we talk about diversification of species, not only in Norway, but globally. And then the question I always get, why don't you suggest the top 10 species to select? And that's because climate change is happening much faster than we manage to publish our results in peer-reviewed journals. It takes time, so this work was published last year, and it's almost outdated already, because we started this in 2021, and so many things have happened when it comes to climate change. But it is published if you want to read more, and please contact me if you have any other questions.
Thank you very much. We can take one quick question, if anybody has a burning question. Oh, one, yeah.
I was wondering, at the start you said it takes 10 to 20
Just as a microphone, actually, sorry, yeah, for people online.
So somewhere at the start, I think you said it takes 10 to 20 years to commercialize a species. So what happens, and can you adapt species during that time to different conditions?
Well, if you start from scratch, you have to catch the wild fish, and then you have to start breeding it and domesticate it. Might take some time to adapt it to different temperatures. That's more work, because you have to go into the biology and really find the genes that will help it tolerate higher temperatures. And the complexity behind this is that you have also seen that if you make a fish more tolerant to higher temperatures, for example, it might be less tolerant to low oxygen levels. So there is a lot of research that is needed to make a species more resilient to temperature and all the other climate stressors.
Very nice. Thank you very much. And so the final talk I will give on behalf of Nadine, unless Nadine is online. No. Okay, so this presentation is from Nadine Johnston, who works at the British Antarctic Survey in the United Kingdom. Nadine, like Aidan, is an expert in ecology, marine ecology in the polar regions. And so the talk today is about using storylines of climate change and high-resolution models to assess the impacts of climate change on economic, environmental, and ecological systems in the Arctic. And now I have the pleasure of... Yeah, it works. So the core ambition of this project that this work has been undertaken in, and the project is the PolarRes project, is to improve regional climate information for impacts assessments in both the Arctic and the Antarctic. And so the flow of information that we have in this is that we have our global climate models, which most of you have mentioned earlier today. And we take the information from those global models and put them into a regional model over these domains that are shown here. So in the Arctic, we have this large domain, Pan-Arctic domain, and in the Antarctic, we have a large domain that covers a lot of the Southern Ocean. And we take that information and turn it into higher resolution information, and then we have a number of impact assessments for both the Arctic and the Antarctic that use that information. And so Nadine is leading most of this work with Hannah Lee from Norse. And let me see if I can... There we go. So just to maybe reiterate a little bit, and I won't labor too long because of time, but the grid spacings for the different climate models are all shown on this. So we have 1,000 kilometers, 100 kilometers, and this is where our CMIP6, our global models, typically are. And so then we have our polar cortex, which is about 50 kilometers. And then we have the PolarRes simulations, which are here at about 10 kilometers. So we're getting down into spaces where we are starting to resolve important and impactful atmospheric phenomena like polar lows and frontal systems, which we are not able to capture in our global models. So this is important and useful information. And just to maybe show quickly some of the impacts that we are using. So we're looking at permafrost thaw and boreal forest fires in the terrestrial domain. So this is primarily in the Arctic that we are doing this. So I guess the key points Nadine has very nicely written for me is that for a long time, these impact modelers have had to kind of do the best they can, as most of you have shown with global model data. That are often, as some of you also highly rightly shown, maybe doesn't have the data that you need sometimes, like maybe snow parameters. And so as part of the development of this high-resolution climate data, the impact modelers had, and the impacts communities, really, scientists, had a strong input and engagement in the development of the high-resolution data to ensure that their data needs could be met. Very often with the climate models, they can produce data, but it is not known that that is needed in the end, so they don't produce it because it costs. But in this project, the climate modelers were able to, the climate modelers and the impact modelers were able to have a conversation about what was needed, what would be useful, how often this data was needed, and so on, to develop the information that they then need for assessing the impacts of climate change on permafrost thaw and boreal forest wildfires. And so the marine impacts that they are looking at include transarctic shipping, which Tommy is looking at, and our colleagues Igor and Vladimir are looking at the dispersion of radionuclides in the Arctic. And then Nadine and Aidan just presented some work, and their colleague Geraint are looking at polar marine ecosystems. And so this last one is in both the Arctic and the Antarctic, as Aidan has mentioned. And so Nadine's recipe for success is to have good communication and collaboration between these two scientific communities, between the climate modelers and the impact modelers from the very beginning. So this idea, and they've published, Nadine and Hannah published this nice paper in BAMS talking about the different frameworks that they've used for developing climate information and the value of this for assessing impacts in the polar regions. And they really stress, and Nadine has a message here, is the importance of communication right from the very beginning of developing climate data. And so the next steps is to refine the impact assessments for the polar res storylines. So they've already done some preliminary work. And publish a report on their findings and convene a policy brief for both Arctic and Antarctic policymakers, and to communicate and disseminate the findings from their outputs. So I've kind of raced through this very quickly. And I think that brings us to the end. So I want to thank you all very much, and a very special thanks to Nadine, Hannah, for their contributions in putting this together. Any questions? Thank you very much. I apologize. I raced through a lot of it, so if you have any questions, please feel free to ask, or grab me at coffee break as well if you want. Any question other than can we go for coffee? Yeah? Okay, go for coffee. Thank you all very much.